Hello, in this video I'm going to show you some examples of connective tissues found in the human body. So hopefully you already watched my video on the introduction to connective tissues, which talks about the importance of the matrix of a connective tissue. So the first up here is areolar tissue, which is a type of loose connective tissue that's found all over the place in the body. Areolar tissue is the true glue of your body. It's what glues different tissues together. And whenever I see areolar tissue, I see strings and beans, right? The strings are part of the matrix, and the strings are actually protein fibers, things like collagen and elastic protein fibers. And the beans are cells called fibroblasts. Fibroblast means to build fibers. So these are the cells that produce like the collagen fibers that we find here. So just to be clear, the fibers are part of the matrix, and the cells here are the fibroblasts. So I think I already mentioned the function of this tissue. It's to glue other tissues together. And I already mentioned that it's found all over the body, but a good example of where we find this would be in the skin. So areolar tissue is found just deep to your epidermis. So your epidermis is the outer layer of your skin, and that's made of epithelial tissue. But just below that, you have a layer of glue, areolar tissue, which helps to keep your epidermis glued to the tissues beneath it. Next up is reticular tissue. And reticular tissue contains reticular fibers in the protein matrix here. And the reticular fibers are important because they create this maze-like structure in the reticular tissue that's important for its function. In terms of cells that we might find here, fibroblasts are going to be the cells that make the reticular fibers. Sometimes we don't see those in the tissue, though, when we look at a histological slide. A lot of times when we look at a histological slide of reticular tissue, we're looking at like the spleen or lymph nodes. Those are the major locations for reticular tissue. And often the cell type that we're going to see there are a type of white blood cell called the lymphocyte. And that's what we see in the picture here. So I mentioned the matrix, the cell types, location. What's the function, right? When I look at reticular tissue, I see what looks like a children's maze. You know those mazes where you have to put your pencil down and you have to make it all the way through without lifting your pencil up? And that particular structure to the reticular tissue is important because let's take, for example, the spleen, right? Blood flows into the spleen, and then the blood cells, including red blood cells, have to move through this maze-like structure of reticular tissue. And what the reticular tissue is doing here is it's pressing on the red blood cells and it's testing the integrity of the red blood cell membrane. What the spleen is trying to do is it's trying to find weak, dead, or dying red blood cells by testing their integrity. And so if the red blood cell is squeezing through a particularly narrow path in the reticular tissue, if it's dead or dying, it might pop. Right? And it's good if the red blood cell pops inside the spleen because now the contents of it can be cleared away. You don't want red blood cells just to pop in your bloodstream because that can be bad for your kidneys and bad for your blood vessel walls. So we're kind of getting like a controlled death of the red blood cells in the spleen because of this reticular tissue. The spleen is often called the red blood cell graveyard of the body. In the lymph nodes, the function is very similar. Again, the reticular tissue in a lymph node is creating a maze-like structure, but blood isn't flowing through a lymph node. It's going to be a fluid called lymph fluid. And what we're doing here is we're trying to slow down the flow of this lymph fluid by making it go through a maze. It's sort of like an intentional traffic jam, if you will. And by slowing down the flow of the lymph, the white blood cells in the area can actually have an easier time looking for the pathogens if the lymph is flowing slow. So we can kind of check for pathogens in that way. Reticular tissues are often stained very darkly in histological slides. You really shouldn't memorize histology based on colors at all because we can use different color dyes for different things. But reticular fibers often stain very dark. Next up is dense regular connective tissue. And dense regular connective tissue is called dense because there's lots of collagen found in the matrix. And these collagen fibers are pressed really closely together in a very dense manner. Now the collagen fibers are also all going in the same direction in the dense regular connective tissue. So because the collagen fibers are all going in the same direction, it has a very regular appearance, and that's where the name comes from. Now the cells here are called fibroblasts again, and so the fibroblasts are going to be the cells that produce the collagen fibers in the tissue. The function of dense regular connective tissue is to provide really strong connections. Right? So this is a very, very, very strong tissue. It does have a little bit of flexibility to it because collagen is a strong but flexible protein fiber. So we're going to see dense regular connective tissue where we need nice strong connections with a little bit of flexibility. So this includes places like tendons and ligaments. Tendons are structures that connect muscle to bone, whereas ligaments are structures that connect bone to bone. And we see movement at both of those places, and so there needs to be a little bit of flexibility, but lots of strength. So it's a great place to have dense, regular connective tissue. So you might have already guessed this, but we have a dense, irregular connective tissue. Dense, irregular connective tissue also contains lots of collagen protein fibers in the matrix. And those fibers are also produced by cells called fibroblast cells. But here the collagen is not laid down in a nice regular way. Instead, some of the collagen fibers are going that way, and some are going that way, and some are going that way, and this way and that way. And the collagen is just laid out in this really messy, random kind of way. And because of that, when we look at a histological slide of dense, irregular connective tissue, it often looks like a finger painting done by a toddler. It's very, very, very messy looking, and that's because of the irregular pattern of the collagen fibers. But don't let that fool you. This also is a strong connective tissue with flexibility to it. It's got a lot more flexibility, though, than the dense regular connective tissue. So we're going to find dense irregular connective tissue in places where we need strength with lots of flexibility. And a good example of this is in the skin. So I mentioned that the outer layer of your skin is called the epidermis. The layer just deep to that is called the dermis. And we've already learned that we have, as a part of the dermis, areolar tissue, which is gluing the epidermis to the dermis below it. The areolar tissue is part of the dermis. Just deep to the areolar tissue in the dermis, we find dense, irregular connective tissue in the dermis. And you might have noticed that you can move your skin around in many different directions. One of the reasons why that's possible is due to the dense, irregular connective tissue there, as that strength with flexibility in multiple directions. And the pictures here, the top one, we're looking at that finger painting, that dense, irregular connective tissue. And then I have a side-by-side comparison of the dense regular versus the dense irregular connective tissues. They look very different, again, because of the way the collagen protein fibers are laid down. Next up is adipose tissue, which is not your typical connective tissue because it lacks a matrix. So it's quite unusual in the connective tissue category. The cell types here are called adipocytes. Adipose is fat, so these are cells that store fat. Adipocytes do not undergo mitosis, but they're very good at undergoing hypertrophy, which is getting bigger, and they're very good at atrophy, which is getting smaller. As they take on or get rid of fat, they will undergo hypertrophy and atrophy. In terms of location, we're going to find adipose tissue deep to the dermis and skin. We find it in a layer called the hypodermis. So that's a nice layer of insulation that helps to regulate body temperature. But we also find adipose tissue as padding around organs, like we have a pad of adipose tissue around our heart and our kidneys. In terms of function, well, I already mentioned that it's involved with thermoregulation. If it's padding, it's protective, but it also stores fat, so it's a way to store energy too. When we look at adipose tissue on a histological slide, it often just looks like a bunch of white, and that's the fat droplets that are stored in the adipocytes. The nuclei of the adipocytes is often not visible because it's smashed up against the cell membrane. So basically there's so much fat inside of these cells that the nuclei get smashed up against the cell membrane, and oftentimes the nuclei are indistinguishable from the cell membrane itself. Now you have to be careful with adipose tissue because it can look a lot like the simple squamous epithelial tissue of the lungs. So here I have the two side by side. Can you tell which is which? The major fluid connective tissue is blood. And blood has a very unusual matrix because it's mostly made out of water, right? The matrix of blood is called plasma, and plasma is mostly water, though it does contain protein. Here it's not a protein fiber, though, it's a globular protein, most of it being a globular protein called albumin. But there's other protein found in plasma, like antibodies, for example, that help to kill pathogens. So the matrix is mostly water with some protein. We do have lots of cells here, though. The major cellular component to blood are erythrocytes, also called red blood cells, and it's their job to carry oxygen. And then we also have white blood cells, also known as leukocytes, and there's lots of variations in the white blood cells that we'll study later. But white blood cells in general help to combat pathogens in the body. Some of the white blood cells are specialized for killing like large parasites, whereas other ones are more specialized for killing specific types of bacteria and viruses. Also in blood, we find a cell type called platelets, and platelets are important for blood clotting. Now, just so you know, the cells of blood are sometimes also referred to as the formed elements of blood. Right, so cells of blood and formed elements of blood are the same thing. It's kind of an old-fashioned term, but it's still seen in textbooks and people still use the term. The main function of blood, of course, is transporting things like oxygen and nutrients, but also it's defensive because of the white blood cell component, and also it's important for blood clotting because of the platelet component. Location, where do we find blood? The answer is not everywhere. Right? We actually only find blood in one very specific location in the human body. That's in our cardiovascular system. So we find blood in our blood vessels and in our heart. Next up is cartilage. Cartilage is sort of a unique connective tissue. It has a matrix that's very unusual. It's not a liquid, but it's not a complete solid either. If you've ever been eating chicken on the bone or ribs or something and bit into some cartilage, you've probably noticed the unusual texture to it. And that texture of cartilage is due to the matrix there. The matrix of cartilage contains something called a proteoglycan, and it's a combination of proteins and carbohydrates, and it kind of gives that unusual texture to it. Now, there are different types of cartilage. My students are responsible for haline cartilage. And haline cartilage is found, for example, at our joints, so where one bone meets another bone. You don't want bone to rub up against bone because then your bones would just erode away. That's what happens in osteoarthritis. We want a nice pad of cartilage around each bone where the bones meet so they can kind of slip and slide past each other. So the haline cartilage found at your joints is very important for reducing friction at those points. The cell type that we find in cartilage are called chondrocytes, and the chondrocytes live in these little chambers called lacunae. So when you look at a histological slide of haline cartilage, you see what looks like these little bubbles with cells inside, and so the bubble structure is actually like a space, a chamber called a lacuna. And inside of that is the cell, the chondrocyte. Next up is bone. Bone is also an unusual connective tissue because it has a matrix that is solid rock, basically. Bone tissue is also called osseous tissue, and there are two main types of bone tissue we find in the human body, compact bone and spongy bone. For purposes of this lecture, I will be only talking about compact bone. So the matrix of bone is composed of an organic component and an inorganic component. The organic component is collagen protein fibers, and the inorganic component is calcium and phosphate crystals, also called hydroxyapatite crystals. So we have a matrix that's rock plus flexible protein fiber. And that collagen is important in bone. It does give bone a little bit of flexibility. We often don't think about our bones being flexible, and I'm not saying you should attempt to see how well they flex, but there is some flexibility to bone due to the collagen component. The calcium phosphate crystals, the hydroxyapatite crystals, give bone its strength. The main cell type, I should say, that we find in bone tissue is something called an osteocyte. So an osteocyte is a mature bone cell, and it's responsible for both building and breaking down the matrix of bone tissue. When we look at a histological slide of bone tissue, we're almost always looking at dead, dried bone. So we actually can't see the osteocytes. We can only see the chambers where the osteocytes were. And just like with cartilage, how we had those chambers called lacunae, where we found the chondrocytes, we have the same thing with bone. We have chambers in bone tissue called lacunae, and that's where we would find the osteocytes. Like I said, that when we look at histological slides of compact bone, it's dead, so we don't see the cells. We only see the lacunae, the chambers where they were. So when we look at a histological slide of bone tissue, most of what you're looking at is the matrix. You're looking at the matrix of the bone tissue. When you look at bone tissue, you usually see this pattern that kind of looks like a tree stump, right? You have what looks like growth rings coming out from a center point, right? And the whole structure, the whole tree stump structure is actually something called an osteon, okay? And the center of the osteon usually has this darker spot called the central canal, and in living bone that would contain blood vessels. And the things that look like growth rings that come out from that are called lamellae, and the lamellae contain the lacunae, which would contain the osteocytes in the living bone tissue. And if you look closely at the bone tissue, you can see that each chamber, each lacuna, is actually connected to a neighboring chamber through little tiny canals that we call canaliculi. And that's a fun word to say, right? Tiny canals, canaliculi. And those are important for the function of the bone tissue. Now, in terms of location, where do we find bone tissue? We find it in bones, right? Part of the skeletal system. In terms of its function, a bone is obviously very supportive, but it's also important for movement, right? Obviously, we need muscles for movement, but muscles need leverage. They need something to pull on, and usually what they're pulling on is our bone. And bone's also protective, too. Now, before we leave connective tissues altogether, and there's many more connective tissues than I've talked about, I just wanted to mention that your body does have a framework of connective tissue. That's kind of what, is holding everything together and giving it the shape that it has. The strength of your body is due to the interacting connective tissues, right? Your organs aren't floating around and moving because connective tissue is holding it in place. Right? And so we do have this connective tissue framework to our body. I also wanted to mention the term fascia. Fascia is a term that comes up quite often, especially for people that are going into like surgical nursing and things like that. And again, fascia is just kind of like a general term referring to the connective tissues of the body. And we have different types of fascia. Superficial fascia would actually be that adipose tissue and other connective tissues that make up the hypodermis. Deep fascia would be deeper to that. So looking at some pictures here, if we looked at a cross section through your forearm, right, in yellow here you can see the superficial fascia that's part of the hypodermis. And then as we go deeper, we can see the red muscle and the white bone. But if you look between the muscle, you have white that's not bone, and that's going to be your deep fascia. So these are connective tissues surrounding the muscle and connecting muscles and bones and providing roots for blood vessels and nerves and things like that. So I just wanted to mention the term in case you ever come across it.